Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another episode of Little Modular. Today we will be playing around with this magnificent, colorful, disco-looking module by VPME called Euclidean Circles. This is one of the most fun and accessible sequencers I have ever worked with. It's so easy and it's so intuitive. It's just pure fun. As the name implies, it is based on the Euclidean algorithm, which I'll talk about in a second. But in essence, we have a 6-track sequencer which can be configured in a few different ways. It could be really simple, it could be complicated, but in both scenarios it's really easy to navigate and to play around, as you have seen a few minutes ago. I also have it coupled with the 6 switches expander right here on the left, which simply allows me to mute each of the 6 outputs, and I strongly recommend to get one of these if you decide to buy Euclidean Circles, because it could be really useful, especially while being used live. So without further ado, let's just dive into it and let me show you around. At the core of the whole concept, we have 3 push encoders which have some LEDs around it. Each of those circles symbolizes a sequence which has 16 steps. Each of those LEDs around the knob is a step. So when you see a yellow step, this is an active step. All the blue steps are inactive steps, and non-lit LEDs are steps that are not included in the sequence. All the basic operations are based on the push encoder. So each of those sequences have 3 modes to work with. So as you can see, each time you push the encoder, it changes its light, indicating that you are in a different mode. So if we go to the blue mode, we can change the length of the sequence. As you can see, I can have it from 1 to 16. The sequence can be longer, you can change the sequences, but I will talk about this later on. So in the blue mode, we choose how long is each of the sequence. If I push it again, I go into orange mode, which allows me to move the whole sequence around. As you can see, I have only 1 step active here, the yellow one, so I can move it around. If I push it again, I can choose how many steps I have in each sequence. You can see 3, 4, 5, and so on and so on. So now, for example, if I want to go back, I push it again, and I'm in the sequence length mode. So let's go back to full 16-step sequence. I push it again, and I can move the sequence left and right. I push it again, and I change amount of steps in each sequence. Now I think it's a good time to talk a bit about the Euclidean algorithm. It is a really simple and effective concept. It simply tries to divide equally a given sequence. So for example, if you have a 16-step sequence, and if you input 4 steps like so, you can see it's divided equally. But if I go to 5, now we could have a bit of different rhythm, as you can see right here, because we have equal distances between the steps right here, but here we have 3 empty slots instead of 2, so we can get some funky rhythms going on. Of course, the coolest rhythms appear when you try to change a different length of the sequence. For example, if you go for 12 or 11 steps and try to input 2, 3, 4 or 5, the combinations are endless, especially if you engage all 6 of the sequencers. So it could get really complex really fast. This sequencer has an internal clock and an external clock. If you want to go for an external clock, you could just input one right here. So for instance, if I do it right now, I'll have the external clock. Here you also have a reset in, so whenever a gate appears here, all of the sequences reset to the first step. That's really important and really useful, especially when you get those polyrhythms and you would like at some point to have all of them reset, so you can retain some kind of repetition, so it's not always all bizarre. So that's a really useful input. Now you can also have an internal clock in here. You access it by pressing and holding the second knob right here, and you can see this bright ring. Now if I move it to the right, I get it faster or slower. So now let's go back to the external clock, so it's easier for me to turn it on and turn it off. Okay, now you can ask, well, we have 6 outputs but only 3 sequences. What's up with that? Well, that is a good question, because indeed we have 6 outputs and 6 sequencers, but they do operate in 2 different ways. In both of the modes, nothing changes for first 3 outputs and first 3 sequences. You always have sequence number 1 going out of output number 1, sequence number 2 going out at the output number 2, and the third sequence sending gates out of out number 3. But outputs number 4, 5, and 6 can work in 2 different ways. The first one is when you press and hold the first button, you have additional 3 sequences, and they do work with 4, 5, and 6. So we switch between 2 pages of 3 circles by pressing and holding the first knob. So it's 1, 2, 3, and now I change and it's 4, 5, 6. But the second mode is a really clever one, and if you switch it in the options, it allows you to output inactive steps from first, second, and third sequence. For example, on the first output, I will have active steps being outputted, but the inactives, so the blue steps, will be outputted out of output number 4, and respectively inactive steps will be outputted at the 5th, and inactive steps from the third sequence will be outputted at the 6th out. Now you change that behavior by going into the settings mode, and you do that by pressing and holding the third knob. Now we have those 3 circles again, and they changed its behavior. Now they serve as navigation tools for different options and modes. The easiest one is the third one right here. This is simply a LED brightness. These could get really bright, blinding bright. So let's just keep it at the default lowest setting because it's still really bright. The upper one right here is meant to load and save presets. It's really easy. If you want to save a preset, you simply navigate to a slot and then you press it and hold it until it all blinks. Now if you want to recall a preset, you just choose a slot again and just press this encoder again, and you have the preset loaded. So now let's go back to the options again. Now the second circle right here is the most complicated. That's where you have all the additional stuff, all the complex stuff, because each of the LEDs around the knob represents a different option and allows you to switch it on or off. Now luckily for us, the most important one, the one responsible for switching the sequencer for the active-inactive steps or 6 independent sequences, is the one at the noon. So the one that's flashing right now, if we press it again, now we change it to the active-inactive steps. So now if we go out of this mode, let's switch off all the other outputs. So I'm just going to leave output number 1 right here. So when I engage my clock, you can hear that I have bass drum on the first track, right? Now the fourth one, if we switch it on, as you can hear, it outputs a clap whenever we have inactive steps right here. So now if I change amount of steps on the first track, I will have active steps outputting bass drum and inactive steps outputting clap. This is very cool, especially for example for open and closed hi-hat, among some other applications. Very clever. Now if I want to go back to the other independent sequences for each of the outputs, I go back to the options, I choose the LED at the noon, and I have again independent sequences. So now when I press and hold this, I can have the clap controlled independently. Okay? I have mentioned the options. If we go to the options, we have 16 different options that allow you to configure this sequencer in many more complex ways. I won't describe all of them, but I will describe some of them because they're really interesting. For instance, what I really like is the pre-scale 1-2 and pre-scale 1-2-3 option. You find those on the second and third option. So if I go here to the second, I choose pre-scale 1-2. What it does is it makes sequence number 2 obey to sequence number 1. What it means is that it will advance only when there is an active trigger on the first sequence. So let's just mute all of the other sequences so we can hear it. That's how it works. Now if you change the amount of steps, you have a different reaction. Okay, so they both interact. Now if we go to the options and choose pre-scale 1-3, which is a third option right here, we have the same behavior with addition of the third sequence being controlled by the second one. So we have this thing advancing only when an active step is active here. So if I unmute it, I change the sound so we can hear it better. Okay, so what happens now is that this sequence is influencing this sequence, and this sequence is influencing this sequence. So we have kind of complex rhythm, and whatever I changed here, it will influence the lower one, and whatever I change here, it will influence all the other sequences. So as you can hear, you get some really funky rhythm going on. And if you ever wondered how Tom York get his funky rhythms on his albums, I will safely bet that he uses a lot of Euclidean rhythms. Just go and listen to his solo albums and you will immediately know what I'm talking about. Now, as I mentioned before, you could have longer sequences than 16 steps because you can chain all of them. So it works like this. First sequence plays once, then it goes to the second sequence, which plays once, and then it goes to the third sequence. And it all goes from output number 1. But let's go straight to chain 1-2-3, which allows me to play all 3 of the sequences. And that is how it sounds like. There are some other options also which I won't discuss because they are kind of boring, but you can, for example, set a fixed pulse length for channel 1. You can have a fixed pulse length for channel number 2, channel number 3. Then you can change a pulse width. It's off 10 milliseconds on 1 millisecond. Then you can have a random 25% probability of muting a step on channel 1. You can do the same thing for channel 2 and channel 3. And then there is the 16th LED, which allows you to manually reset all channels to the first step on the next external or internal clock signal. And there is also kind of a factory reset, which you do by pressing and holding button number 2 on setting number 16 right here. So if you go to 16 right there and you hold this for at least 5 seconds, it will erase all presets and settings. So use that with caution. And that's it. That's all there is to this sequencer. And as I said before, it's the most fun I have ever had with any gate sequencer. Of course, you can not only use that for percussion things, but definitely use that with some VCAs and some other destinations. It's just bonkers. This is an instant hit for me. Definitely get this 6-switch expander. It allows you for some cool stuff while playing live. You can, for example, mute a channel, set some wicked rhythm, unmute it, and off you go with a new pattern. So this is really useful. That's it. So thank you very much for watching, and as usual, if you enjoyed that video, please share it, please subscribe it, and spread the good word. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.